Alright, one take. Let's talk about Triforcing. Alright, so Triforcing. You commonly hear it called that. I like to call it damage routing, but Triforcing comes from only using 3 sides of a cube, and basically not all of the attachment points on the cube to direct damage, blah blah blah. So if I have a line of blocks here, and damage comes in here, and I want it to prevent it from going to my middle. So back in the olden days, what this used to mean was it used to mean something along the lines of, like, kind of, not a blade of armor, but there would be multiple steps in the armor. You'd basically have an inside that was isolated completely from the outside, so all your juicy bits would be right here, right? And then damage would strike, and it would have to go around, or most of the time it would be in increments. So you would have a shot strike your first layer, get rid of your first layer, you'd have a second layer, third layer, so on, right? And then each layer would be evenly distributed. And you could mix it up to make sure that, you know, there were multiple connection points over different areas, and so on and so forth, right? So, you know, damage has to zigzag to get all the way in, and, you know, you can take this and then go to a 3-dimensional pattern with that, where your first layer has attachment points in the corner, and then your second layer has attachment points in the middle, and so on and so forth. So that was back when direct damage was a thing. And direct damage, basically, before we can talk about the different damage modes, we have to talk about how damage works. So, damage flows from block to block, and it spreads out until it's used up, essentially. And it's checking its damage against the health of the blocks as it goes, and it will, once its health has been used up, then the damage stops. But there's kind of caveats to how that's calculated. So you can think of it as kind of, I think Cataphat described it as ripples in a pool, which I like that metaphor. So if damage lands on the red, it would spread out to the orange, and once it consumed the health of the orange, it would spread out to the yellow. And this is all done in one swift cut. And so the thing is, though, is damage cannot go from orange to yellow until all the orange are destroyed in the next step. And this is regardless of geometry. So what that means is that you can have a block like a rod, and the rod, regardless of its health, geometry, whatever, is going to wick damage just like a single block, right? So regardless of its shape, its health, anything else. And you can see this with the paint gun. I'm going to quickly recolor this, but just for quick reference, so on the first step it'd be red. If this is direct damage, single strike, and consuming the number of the health of the number of blocks that I hit. So, and then yellow, oops, and then after that we go green. So now, actually, hang on, before I do that, yellow on the rod. Oh, come on, paint it. There we go. Then green on the next step. Now you notice it's going to jump across the block here and continue on to the other side. So this is blue here, right? And you can see that you can roughly mimic how damage spreads with the paint gun. So if I hit it with the black, you'll see it pretty much follows that pattern exactly. And this goes for anything with multiple attachment points and health and geometry and whatever. So if I take a dish shield module, where's my dish shield module? There it is. And I have it connected at however many other points. When that gets hit, damage is going to spread out from all the different points, and once it reaches it, so if damage is flowing in from this end and it wants to go up here, so it's going to go, you know, here, here, and then on the next step it's green. So it's going to go to your dish shield module, and then it would go past that there. And you can see that with the paint gun, like so. Okay, so let's talk about things getting disconnected from the body of your bot. So when your bot splits, what's happening is you have a main hole of your bot, and it's basically checking. Your health is your CPU. So you have, I think it's like 20%. Once you get down to 20% CPU, you die. Now, the health or the damage that the person has to do to get you to that point is a function of what blocks are removed. So if someone's doing, you know, however much damage, I think it's yeah, 1500 for medium. So 1500 damage would take this little chunk off. And that's 1 CPU of health damage. So if you're 2000 CPU, then it's 1/2000th of your entire health pool. And obviously they're going to do a lot more than that. So you want your effective components, or your health effective components up front. So you want your juicy bits, like lower health per CPU parts. If you take the health of a part and you divide it by the CPU, you get the health per CPU of the part. You want to preserve those components for last. So a hover would be a low health per CPU component, right? You want those on the inside, you want them protected, and you want them to be the last things remaining, because that's your least healthy part of your bot, and it's also the most functional. You want to still be able to move around. Same thing with guns and anything else that makes you move and shoot and do all the things that make you a good robot. So let's talk about, I got kind of on a sidetrack there, but let's talk about splitting parts off from your main bot. So you can actually see this once again in the build room. If you cut two components off from one another, the component with less CPU health is going to get removed from the main. So like if I were to put a dish shield module here and then cut this off from the body of my bot, this has more CPU. This half is going to stay, right? So this happens after damage is calculated. So to be clear, I'm going to kind of transition to the single point damage things here, which is what I really want to talk about. But what I'm trying to say is the way that it doesn't work is, it hits and then checks every step to see if your bot's split. Like if the damage were to land here and then spread, and really it's going to consume the next step of block as well, it doesn't check every step of the way to see if part of your bot's disconnected. It's going to flow out first, and then it's going to say, okay, all my damage is used up by the health of the components that I've touched, and any remaining damage is going to be distributed amongst the remaining blocks. So if it does just enough to destroy all these yellows minus like 2, right? It's basically going to, when it gets to that section of doing damage, it's just going to take and kind of roll the dice on all these remaining cubes. There might be a mechanic that I'm not aware of exactly how it functions, but that's roughly how it functions, is from what I've seen, right? So it's going to use up all these blocks. Then, once it's calculated the damage per that single hit, it's going to remove the blocks. And then it will check and it will see if your bot's disconnected from itself. So what this means is we can use, say you want to protect a gun. These are going to be examples that are meant to be educational, not functional. So, but here we are. Let's have a gun here. I don't know. Oh, a little tiny laser wasp. Now we want to protect this gun from damage coming in these two lines. What a nice dual mount. I mean, two connected in two places of your bot. We'll talk about those later. This is just the damage basics for now. So what we can do is we can take an electroplate and we can stick it here, and we can stick it here. And what that means is when damage is flowing up this line, so this has a lot of health. This is like 22 blocks, and you can lay out 22 blocks in your bay and check the health against them. In fact, it's got more health than 22 blocks, because I think it's 2,000 health per CPU. Yeah, I think so, yeah. So, roughly. It's more than your medium cubes. Problem is, it's a single point, so if this gets destroyed and the health of the shield isn't used up, then it goes away. But we're just about to talk about that. So damage flowing up this line, and then to yellow, and then to green. So at this point, before damage can move on to the mounting block of the gun, it's going to have to use up the health of this shield first. So if this is a single strike of damage, so if a laser hit this point and it would flow like this, and say it's consuming this exact amount of health, it's going to have to use up this green plate before it can move on to blue. And you can see that with the paint gun again, right? So my shield is getting damaged before my gun mounting point. Now, say that the shield sinks up, and say that the shield uses up most of that damage, but it still has some left over. So what's going to happen, it's not even going to get to blue. It's basically going to get to yellow. It's going to here, and then once it's at this point, it's going to divide up its remaining damage between these two components, and it's not going to be enough to use up the full health of the plate. But now what happens is either the plate or the block, either or, it's going to get distributed. One might stay. If the plate stays, then it gets removed because it's not attached to your bot. If the block stays, it just kind of hangs out there. But the end goal here is it will not reach your gun before using up the health of that plate. So that can be used to isolate components of your bot. This isn't always the best thing because you're technically getting critted out here, right? You're losing some of the health of that shield that you would normally want to keep. But you can do this by, I call it kind of like natural triforcing, where say you just happen to have some high health component nearby, right? And remember we talked about rods? So rods can be used to jump damage, to damage sync points. So if I put an electroplate here, well, technically I would need it, it would be dividing it between it, but let's say I have it here, just for the sake of discussion. And I have my small rod attached here. So now, when damage flows, orange, yellow, and then green. And now the nice thing is since this is a multi-connection electroplate, it doesn't matter if the health isn't fully used up because it'll still be attached by those other points. It's not getting separated from the body of our bot. But now, for damage to reach our gun, it has to first use up the health of this entire electroplate. So you can use this to sometimes prevent damage from spreading to another area. Another example of something that I saw a long time ago when I was first getting into this sort of thing was back in the good old days of copters. There were two-legged mech copter hybrids. E2P kind of was the one him and Save the Whales came together, and they were like, all right, we're gonna make some meta stuff, which it had been done before at that point, but not quite to this extent. Right, so you had, we need the smallest legs, which are here, and then let's just put these blocks back down. So they would have the two legs attached by a rod, and rods are kind of special in that they have properties that allow them, so we'll talk about clipping blocks later, but basically you can clip the center of a rod, and once the block's hitbox, regardless of its geometry, is always a cube. So once it gets shot out, there can only be one hitbox in a place at a time. Once it gets shot out, then what happens is this rod centerpiece here is no longer a hitbox. It doesn't even exist. You basically have two floating connection points that are attached by nothing, and you can shoot right through this in test mode. So that's especially strong with the 5 long rods, so the longer ones here. Basically anything that can be wrapped, so you could wrap this one. But getting back to the point, and what they would do is they would have a module back here, and then your copter plates would be over here. It could be a power mod, which, by the way, if you didn't know, the tops of power mods are really easy to clip into things, so you can have them like right here, and it will go around the leg hitboxes. But anyway, so dish shield module here, and now what's happening is the damage is having to go through both legs before it ever reaches the dish shield module, right? So first step, let's turn off mirror mode, and then second step, and then third step, and then fourth step, and then fifth step. Now we've reached the other leg, but we haven't reached our module. So this would ensure that you used up the health of both of your legs before your module was destroyed. And you'd have copters in the back, so these were your backup movement, but they would also function as a damage sink for Mega Rail. And then the nice thing is since there's an attachment point right from leg to leg, the material around this can get shot out, and that rod, since it's not attached to any other point, like if this were blocks here, damage could technically destroy all your attachment points. You could have this part shot off, and then it gets isolated from the body of your bot just because the direct damage flowed there. But if you have a rod there, then it holds up the other leg, and it's preserved, and you can use it as a functional component. Alright, so now that we've talked about all that, let's talk about different ways of... Oh, actually, we should talk about damage. That's right. We were going to talk about the different modes of damage. So, back in the olden days, you made your a blade of armor, right? You had multiple layers. You know, you had your weave. Ooh, fancy. Which, well, weaves are kind of cool in that the damage that flows, the way it flows across them is it prefers one direction over the other, right? So if I'm damaged, direct damage, and I want to go up or down, I have to go over and up. So that's 4 steps of damage. If I'm flowing side to side, I can just go straight side to side, right? So if I make a big old weave of this, and I'm just going to skip over some of the steps here. Oh, I should have mirror mode on. Alright, so damage in this case flows side to side faster than it does up and down. But back in the good old days, people would have multiple layers of this stuff. You'd have, I think of this as another weave over the front of your bot, and then you would have some sort of isolated core. You know, maybe you'd have another layer, and then you'd have your good stuff back here, right? So damage would strike, and it would get rid of this first layer, and you know, you've got it connected at the corners or whatever, so that it's a long damage path into your center, right? Because damage has to travel this way to get to your core. And then you'd have all your juicy bits here in the middle, right? So you'd have your module, and you'd have frickin' hovers on it, and it'd be able to move, and it'd be like an escape module. Well, that doesn't work anymore, because we have different types of damage now. So, and everything at the end of the day is direct damage, but we're going to talk about 3 kind of main types of damage in the game. So you've got rails, and what they do is they basically shoot, think of it as shooting 3 shots instantly that are a third of the damage of the rail. So if it hits something, it's going to strike with the first shot, and then it's going to say, okay, now that this is basically happening instantaneously. It's saying, okay, that first bit is removed, now we're going to move on to the second layer, and we're going to use another third of our damage, and then we're going to go on to the third layer, and we're going to use another third of the damage. So you end up with this pitting. So normally, you know, and if these were to spread out damage-wise, it'd be like this, right? Whereas normally, if you took that same amount of blocks and you did direct damage, it would basically be one giant kind of pit at the front, right? So instead of this, you get this. So you're more likely to hit functional components. And what that means for this model, now actually the other thing is if there's only 2 layers, what happens is it's basically going to dump all its damage on the remaining layer. So if it hits a single layer of blocks, it's going to do this same pattern here, right? It's going to spread out until all its health is used up on the first layer. It's just going to be like laser damage. If there's multiple layers, or any cubes remaining after the first shot, it's going to dump it on that second layer. So it'll use its remaining 2/3 of damage here. And someone can correct me in the comments if I'm wrong about that, but that's essentially how it works. And then there's plasma, there's AoE. So plasma, the way it works is it basically has an area of effect. So it basically draws a circle around an area, and then it picks a couple points within that circle. There's an actual pattern. If you take a flat sheet of blocks sometime, and you shoot it with plasma, you'll see this pattern, and it kind of looks like this. But this is within the volume of the area. It picks blocks within the volume that it's damaging, and this would be 3-dimensional, right? There'd be a couple blocks within the volume that it picks, and then the damage flows out from those points like normal laser damage or direct damage, like we were talking about earlier. What this means is that basically it picks random points on your bot and it starts damage there, which isn't a problem if you have like a cohesive whole bot. But if you have, I don't know why you would do this, but if you have 2 halves of your bot only connected by a single line or something, like this, and it strikes that line in the middle of your bot, it's going to pop that part off. So you really don't want, you want to avoid parts that are only attached by a single point. So if I were to just have like a rod-mounted hover coming out of the front of my bot, yes, this point of your other end of your rod mount is inside your bot. It's safer, right? It's not towards the front here, and you can wrap your rod, right? So it's really good. It'll hang out even after all the material in this front area is shot out. And by the way, since we're talking about wrapping, you can wrap a hover. Anytime you can clip a block around an object, it basically protects that object. So the hitboxes for this hover are removed here. You only basically have this remaining hitbox where the attachment point is. So your hover is now a single block size. That's why people like to use the tiny hovers. So, and there's all sorts of clipping that you can do with that. But plasma can hit this point inside your bot. If someone direct hits you, or they hit you from the bottom, then if this block has a chance of being destroyed early, and it's going to cut your hover off. Now, you can kind of... Parts with larger volume tend to attract plasma, and not by any mechanic, it's just simply by the virtue of they have more volume. This wheel has the volume of, X number of blocks. And like we talked about earlier, you can clip stuff into the wheel, right? So you can take... I don't know if this one's clippable, actually. Let me see if it is. Yes, it is. Okay. So, like, these blocks will take damage, and they take up this hitbox, but you still essentially have a volume that's like this for the wheel, right? So just percentage-wise, this single component has the same chance as this many of blocks being hit, right? So volume-wise, if you compare like the volume of your bot to the volume of this, and then furthermore, plasma can land off-center. So like if plasma lands here and its area of effect is, yay big, then it's just barely clipping your wheel, and all the remaining, I like to call them damage propagation sites, are located in the volume. A large percent, all of them are going to have to be concentrated in this small area. So it's going to pick like this cube and this cube and this cube and your wheel like several times over. It can pick, since it has a larger volume, it can start in multiple places on the same part, right? So it's more likely that that wheel is going to be destroyed. And back in the good old days, people would use... Now, actually, this is still a thing. So cosmetics don't directly stop stuff anymore, but since they have a large volume, they have no health, but they have a large volume, and they can take damage. They can't take direct damage anymore, which means a laser can shoot through them. It won't hit them. It'll hit the blocks behind them. But AoE damage will still get soaked by these large components, and then it's going to be directed to, a part that isn't as valuable. So if you have your wheel here, right, now the sign is more likely to take the damage, percentage-wise, of this volume than the wheel. So that's how you use damage sinks. So this is also the reason, if anybody loves your sprinters, they're sprinters, and you have some sort of bot and you have sprinter legs underneath. Sprinter legs are huge. Like, their volume is just absolutely massive. And so when plasma lands, it only has, like, its sphere of its AoE is like this, right, if they're splashing the ground. Well, guess what? The majority of the volume is closest to the ground. It's your legs. That's why your legs get splashed off. So some people, I've seen it with mech players, but sometimes people will drop some blocks down between them. They'll have some thing come out in front, right, to help soak up the damage. You don't want to do this too much because it'll interfere with your ability to actually make contact with the ground and climb up hills, right? So if you're climbing a steep hill, your front might make contact and prevent you from climbing. So those are just some considerations, but generally you can use pieces to help try and soak up the plasma damage a little better. So that's why we don't have these models anymore where you have kind of an inside wrapped with multiple layers, right? Because your inside is vulnerable in multiple ways now. So this is going to transition into my next video, which we're going to talk about some modern Triforcing, damage routing, whatever you want to call it, techniques.